2016 was a rough year. Between the numerous celebrity deaths, terrorist attacks, Trump, Brexit, and many other events, 2016 is often joked about as being the worst year ever. But is it really? In truth, it isn't even close. Here are 10 years that are way worse than 2016. 72,000 BC, the Long Night. There are plenty of bad years in the history of the universe, but the worst year in human history would probably be the year that humans came the closest to extinction. Well, so far. One year, around 72,000 BC, there was a volcanic super eruption on the island of Sumatra in present-day Indonesia. The explosion was massive. It exploded with the force of 1.5 million Hiroshima-sized bomb. A layer of volcanic ash about 6 inches thick settled all over Asia. The skies darkened and global temperatures fell. Similar to a nuclear winter, the Long Night descended and lasted for many years. Food sources died off, and DNA testing indicates that the human population was reduced to between 3,000 and 10,000 people. 1348, the Black Death. In 1348, Europe was overwhelmed by a pestilence that had already laid waste to Asia. It was called the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. Towns were especially hard hit, yet in London, where people lived side by side in houses, rats flourished and street-tossed garbage. The plague became an epidemic at lightning speeds. Even people in the countryside were not spared. Hundreds of years would pass before Europe would recover from its near total population loss. By the end of it all, nearly 3/5 of the population, or 50 million people, had died. 1492, the discovery of the Americas. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's what they teach us in school as children. What they neglect to tell us is how for the indigenous people of the Americas, this was the beginning of the end. Figures state that 80 to 90% of the native population died as the result of European diseases. In addition to diseases, Columbus and others brought with them slavery and forced many of them to convert to Christianity. 1816, the year without a summer. Snow in June, freezing temperatures in July, and a killer frost in August were just some of the highlights. While people at the time had no idea what caused these horrible conditions, scientists and historians now know that the biggest volcanic eruption in human history on the other side of the world, Mount Tambora in Indonesia, in April 1815, spewed millions of tons of dust, ash, and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, temporarily changing the world's climate and dropping the global temperature by as much as 3 degrees. 1863, the Civil War. The Civil War was hands down America's bloodiest conflict. Hundreds of thousands died from fighting and disease, and it is estimated that 2% of the population, an estimated 620,000 men, lost their lives in the line of duty. If you take that as a percentage of today's population, the toll would have risen as high as 6 million souls. 1919, World War I and the influenza outbreak. The First World War had just concluded and many nations were reeling from the massive death tolls due to the battle. To make matters worse, a flu pandemic infected 500 million people and resulted in the death of 50 to 100 million people, or nearly 5% of the world's population. In America, the 18th Amendment was introduced, which prohibited alcohol. This change ushered in a decade of lawlessness. On top of that, the bloody summer of 1919 saw race riots in many cities across the country. Definitely not a good year to be alive. 1933, the Great Depression. 1933 was the worst year of the Great Depression. Unemployment peaked at 25.2%. 1 in 4 people did not have a job. Some 13 to 15 million Americans were unemployed and nearly half of the country's banks had failed. Although the relief and reform measures put into place by President Franklin D. Roosevelt helped lessen the worst effects, the economy would not fully turn around until after 1939, when World War II kicked American industry into high gear. 1943, World War II. The world was at war again, and 1943 stood out as a truly awful year. The Holocaust grew more deadly by the week, and Nazis had systematically deported and killed more than 1.3 million Jews by spring of 1943. Germany took over much of the Soviet Union with millions in casualties on both sides. The Japanese waged war with the Western empires in Asia. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Japanese American citizens were interned in America, in what was to become a mass policy of racial profiling. Overall, 1943 was definitely a low point in human history. 1994, the Rwandan Genocide. An estimated 800,000 Rwandans, mostly from the Tutsi tribe, were killed in just 100 days, mostly by the Hutus. Begun by extreme Hutu nationalists in the capital of Kigali, the genocide spread throughout the country with staggering speed and brutality, as ordinary citizens were incited by local officials and the Hutu power government to take up arms against their neighbors. By the time the Tutsi-led Rwandese Patriotic Front gained control of the country through a military offensive, hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were dead and many more displaced from their homes. 2001, 9/11. September 11th, 2001 marks the Al-Qaeda's attack on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, causing the death of almost 3,000 people. It marks the beginning of the War on Terror, and policies created then led to the US and UK entering to what many deem a number of ill-conceived wars, and continue to seriously affect the world today.